Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to the third of our series of Maribyrnong Ideas Forums. I'm your host, Bill Shorten. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. We're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I acknowledge the traditional owners wherever people on this Zoom, on Facebook, listening and participating in. Just a few housekeeping matters before we hear from Andrew Leigh. We're recording this session and we will be live on Facebook and YouTube. For those of you who haven't been at one of these events, they're designed to be relaxed, respectful, inclusive as well. A few things to give you the best experience. We encourage you to keep your video on. We found it really does add to a sense of being together that Zoom can facilitate. If you are on a computer or laptop, you can set your screen to gallery view by clicking the button on the top right-hand side. Now, there is a chat function for asking questions. Please use it to ask questions or make a comment. We would welcome you to introduce yourself so we know who's asking the question, who is in the Zoom room. If you're not able to use the chat function, please use the raise your hand feature. If you feel like having your question asked, but you don't want to ask it, that's fine as well. And just tell us that and we'll ask the question for you, but we'll acknowledge who it is. Everyone is muted. An administrator, and I've got some very capable staff on the line, will unmute you if you're called on during the question and answer. But you will have to accept the unmuting before you can be heard. So if there are any technical issues, please private message our tech support person in the chat. Now, I'd now like to hand you over to Andrew Leigh. Andrew, he's pretty modest, but I think he is one of the cleverest people in the Federal Parliamentary Caucus. I feel he's probably even underutilised at this point, although he wouldn't say that. And I think that he's got a lot. He's just a bright, bright thinker who can range across many areas, but he's done a lot of work on inequality, and when I was leader, I found him very instructive in how we can frame up economic debates in a way where Labor can win the argument. So I might, with no further ado, hand over to Andrew Leigh. I think we've scheduled an hour, but we probably 7:45, 7:50 will start to wind things up. Andrew, be my guest.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks so much for the chance to talk to you and to this third Maribyrnong Ideas Forum. Can I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking to you tonight? Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawal Wadi, Dara Wadi, Dindi, Wangarlinjinyin, and acknowledge any Indigenous people on the call tonight. The issue of egalitarianism is one that ties closely to the question of reconciliation. If we're going to build a fairer Australia, that's got to involve a fairer compact with the First Nations people. Bill, you and I have talked a lot about the issue of inequality and how fundamental it is to the Australian character. When the settlers European settlers came here in the 1800s from Britain, they felt like they'd arrived in a country where Jack wasn't just as good as his master, but maybe better. Ours wasn't a place where you used words like sir or ma'am. It was a country where you used the word mate. And there's still distinctive egalitarian traits about Australia. We're a country that doesn't stand up when the Prime Minister enters the room, that doesn't have private areas on the beaches. Many of us will sit in the front seat of the taxi. Well, we did until COVID came along. And we certainly prize that sense of shared mateship. But what I worry about is that the tradition of egalitarianism is increasingly under threat. We've seen just in the course of this response to the pandemic, some of the worst and best of Australia. Most firms did the right thing when they got the JobKeeper payment, but some decided to pay it out with executive bonuses, taking money from the taxpayer and turning it around and giving it as bonuses to people on seven-figure earnings. One bloke who did this was the best paid CEO in Australia last year. I promise you, he didn't need any more money. And a system that was designed to help battlers has also served to line the pockets of billionaires. So Jerry Harvey, Jamie Packer, Solomon Lew, all of them run companies which receive JobKeeper support. Nothing wrong with that, but they then turned around and paid significant dividends, meaning that millions of dollars went into their pockets while their firms were on taxpayer support. I think it's pretty fundamental that this is the wrong way to be behaving. Certainly that's the view of the Business Council of Australia, it's the view of the Australian Tax Office, but it hasn't been the view of the Morrison government, which seems to think either that inequality isn't rising one day, or the next day they say, well, yeah, all right, inequality is rising, but it doesn't matter at all because a rising tide lifts all boats. But the fact is, a rising tide hasn't lifted the tugboats as much as it's lifted the yachts. We've seen over the last generation earnings rising 3 times as fast at the top 10th of the distribution as for the bottom 10th of the distribution. It used to be that it took a decade or two for a factory worker to earn as much as the CEO of the company. Now it would take you a career or two, a couple of 100 years for a regular worker to earn what the CEO gets. And we're seeing not only this rise in economic inequality, Bill, that you've spoken about so much, but also a rise in civic disconnection. We're seeing Australia increasingly fraying as fewer people attend church, are part of a union, fewer people join an association, and fewer people even turn out to vote in an election. Compared to the early 1980s, Australians have half as many close friends and are half as likely to know our neighbours. I used to think these two problems were distinct, the problem of inequality and the problem of loneliness or isolation. But increasingly now, Bill, I think they're two sides of the same coin. I reckon that Australia used to be much more of a communitarian society, more of a nation of we. And increasingly now we've become an individualistic society, the society of me. And funnily, you can even see this in the books that are published in Australia. An exercise for a book called Reconnected that Nick Terrell and I have just put out. We go through the Google Books archive and we look at the number of times books published in Australia use the word we and the number of times they use the word me. And we find on this we to me index that Australian books are less likely to use the word we and more likely to use the word me just over the course of the last couple of decades. So we've become a little bit too much of an Ayn Rand society, a little bit too individualistic, and public policy hasn't helped with that. It's tougher to organise a union, and taxes have gone down more at the top end than at the bottom end. Too many of the tax breaks are directed towards people who are already on 6 or 7 figure incomes. The tax system, as you've once put it, Bill, is increasingly turned into a 2-class system. One class for the people up the front of the plane with a whole lot of tax breaks, their ability to use tax havens to exploit loopholes in the Caymans, and another system where PAYG taxpayers are expected to pay full freight. It's not fair, and it's not something that we as Australians should be proud of, because we ought to see our country as one in which egalitarianism really marks us out. Just to close, I think one of my favourite stories of World War II is the stories that Gavin Dawes tells of Australians in the Japanese prisoner of war camps. Gavin Dawes says that the Americans were the cowboys of the camps, the individualists, who was every man for himself. The Brits hung under their class structure like bulldogs. The officers got more food and better tents, and so they ate better and slept better. And the Aussies, they set up their little male-bonded welfare states in which they shared what they had, and the people who slept in the tents were the ones who were sicker. And more of the Aussies at the end of World War II walked out on 2 feet than the Americans or the British. That ought to be a great source of national pride for us, and something that should inspire us to create a more egalitarian Australia, more of a country of we than a nation of me. Because let's face it, no great achievement in history, no big creation of a building, no winning of a war, no success in a political campaign has ever been achieved by an individual alone. And that's why I'm really proud to be part of a party with you, Bill, that is definitively a party that prizes the we, the collective, over the me, the individual. Let me stop it there and really look forward to the conversation with you and all the bright people you've got on Zoom tonight.
Hey, thanks very much, Andrew. And I'm sure I speak for the not just the people participating on Zoom, but the 150 or so on Facebook, and say you tell a good story. And I think part of the art of politics is to be a good storyteller, Andrew, and you really do connect. Listen, we've got a range of questions. They are eclectic to begin with. But what I might do is start off with Tristan Hazelwood's asked a curly question. And he said, Bill and Andrew, but I'll let you go first because you're our guest. What are your thoughts on a resource consumption tax to replace existing taxation measures as a means of addressing inequality? And whilst you're answering that, because I know you can do two things at once, Tim Morrison has said, why don't the words the Commonwealth of Australia appear on our currency anymore?
Wow, well, I have no idea what's going on with the currency, but I do love the word Commonwealth. It reminds us that that what we call a nation is also something about sharing the wealth between us. We had a go at a different system of resource taxation, which didn't work out terribly well for the Labor Party, and I don't think we've got immediate plans to be returning to that. But I do think that we need to make sure that mining multinationals are not exploiting tax breaks that aren't available to regular small businesses. So the tax office has taken a pretty close look at some of these transfer pricing arrangements, and they notice something odd when they compare the tech firms and the mining firms. The mining firms say, well, we need to market our ore, and marketing is a very high value activity. We do that offshore, and that's why we book a lot of profits offshore. And then the tech companies come to the tax office and they say, well, really, we don't do any production in Australia. All we do is marketing, and marketing is a very low value activity. We do that in Australia, but that's why we barely book any revenue in Australia. And the tax office says, there's something that smells a bit fishy about this. So I reckon cracking down on some of that inconsistency would be a good way to go.
Yeah, good answer. And the Commonwealth of Australia on the currency, we're not sure about that. Actually, I was Assistant Treasurer. I'll find out the answer to that for you. Listen, Steve Parnas, who's one of our very active members and very involved as a doctor in the AMA, has put forward a question on the chat room, which I'll just go to. And it's about, he'd like you to tease out the proposition, at the heart of progressive politics versus conservatism, it's us rather than me. Could you tease out the idea that an egalitarian nation can be a prosperous one? How is being fair good for business?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. Well, when it comes to egalitarianism and trust, that's what makes business work. Henry Ford once said that he raised his workers' wages because he wanted them to be able to buy his cars. And if you're a dumb employer, then you try and drive your workers' wages down while you hope for your customers' wages to go up. If you're a smart employer, you realise your workers and your customers are the same group of people, and that shared prosperity works best. And in terms of trust, we know that low trust countries are countries where business doesn't work particularly well. If you think your business partner is always going to rip you off, you're not going to do business on a handshake. You're going to write out expensive contracts or maybe not do the deal at all. So that bedrock of trust is actually fundamental to capitalism. And I think also, people have wondered recently why there's been a move in surveys of millennials decreasing their support for capitalism. Well, maybe they should look at the fact that it's a whole lot easier to support capitalism when you've got a bit of capital. And the fall in home ownership rates among young Australians, I think, is one of the reasons why some young Australians don't feel as though they're as invested in the system as they would be if home ownership.
sorry, I didn't realise you wanted to ask that question. Is there something you'd like to add, mate?
Oh, I mean, this touches on everything in political philosophy. Andrew's comment about there being more of the commentary of me rather than we in recent decades is very telling, and it reflects on everything. One thing that I hope this hour will go past without ignoring is one of Labor's traditional strengths, and that is the area where I work, and that is the provision of healthcare. I'm proud to live in a system where the first question I ask a patient is, how can I help you, rather than how will you pay? And while there are some differences, the homeless person down the street can get the same sort of care as the CEO, and that's something we should be proud of and continue to work on. And thankfully, it's become one of the, I suppose, sacred cows of Australian politics. Touch Medicare and you pay the penalty.
Yeah, a thing we can never take for granted, but that's well said, Steve. Andrew, there's some good questions here. Kathleen Loy, I don't know if Kathleen wants to ask the question. Oh no, she's on the F book. So do you think there needs to be a basic income for citizens? What do you think, Anne? I mean, and I guess I'm going to add to that question. What do you think about universal basic income as a policy?
Bill, I admire many of the advocates of universal basic income, but I don't think that it is the way to go. And part of that is just the sheer economics of the thing. Yeah. There's two ways of paying for a universal basic income. One is to take all of the existing social safety net, the pension, disability support payments, National Disability Insurance Scheme, scrap it all and then pay it out on a per capita basis. And that might give you, I don't know, $5,000 a person, something like that. Not much to live on, and quarter of what a pensioner is getting by on right now. Plus, you're cutting a cheque to Jamie Packer. You're cutting a cheque to Solomon Lew. You're cutting a cheque to Bill and me, and we don't need your welfare. The other way is to raise taxes to higher than the highest countries in the world. So if you wanted to be delivering something like $20,000 a year, something like a pension level, then you would have to have astronomical levels of taxation. So a universal basic income, as you know better than anyone, Bill, is the opposite of Australia's system. We go really targeted. In fact, we target our welfare system more than anyone else in the world. So for no country in the world would it be a bigger jump to go to a universal basic income than for Australia. And in that sense, I think a universal basic income is kind of un-Australian in the sense that it is complete anathema to our approach, which is find the people who are most vulnerable, target the welfare to them, but then phase it out and ensure that you're not cutting checks to people on high incomes.
Yeah, I just think it's, I mean, that's exactly right. It's unaffordable if it was to be generous, and if it wasn't to be generous, it'll be, it means that a whole lot of really deserving people will actually have major cuts in their circumstances. But the debate's a good debate, but it's, I think Andrew's right. We've gone down the path of a targeted safety net, and a generous safety net's what we want. But talk about the safety net. Listen, there was one question from David Costa, which I'll just quickly answer, Andrew. It is, hey, Bill, are we going to support a royal commission into veteran suicide? Brother, please support this. Yeah, we do. We do think that there needs to be a fundamental look at veteran suicide. I mean, I also think the whole question of suicide, not just veterans, is a major trauma in Australia. But there's no doubt that we've put our veterans in harm's way, and there has been shocking numbers of self-harm as people have come out of those periods of service back into civilian life, and the transition hasn't worked well for people. So, David, the answer is that we do want to see veteran suicide given the attention it deserves. And frankly, I don't understand why Morrison, I mean, you can say a lot about him, but he's got rat cunning. I don't know why on earth he just hasn't picked this issue up. But anyway, we'll keep pushing for veterans.
Bill, can I ask you something on that issue? Because both of us and maybe our colleagues are going to be talking about these awful revelations out of the SAS, which involve terrible wrongdoing by a small number of people. Just from some of the soldiers I've spoken to today, they're as gutted as anyone by these revelations. How should public officials like us be talking about the SAS in order that we're not causing harm to some of those veterans who did good and honourable service to their country?
Well, I suppose it's like a whole lot of things. I don't judge everyone by the actions of a few. I've had the privilege of I've gone to Afghanistan twice. I've gone to Iraq, where our men and women are. I've seen them in the Middle East. They do an amazing job. They're highly professional. Clearly, there's enough concern here for this investigation to have gone to the next level, and clearly there's some incredibly distressing evidence has come forward. I'm not going to prejudge, but I just say to the vast majority of men and women of Australia who serve, I respect your service, and I don't for 1 second judge everyone by the reports about a few. Let's not make that mistake of, when the Vietnam veterans came back, it's a separate issue, but they were judged for the merit of the war, whereas they didn't deserve that individual judgment for them. And in this case, again, if something's gone wrong, and clearly a lot of senior people think something has gone really wrong, then we have a system which is identifying it. And I don't consider most service people deserve to be judged by the actions of a few.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's much more complicated than that, but as a general rule, let's take the service as we find it.
Yeah, really wise words.
Talking about the safety net, and questions are coming in thick and fast. Said Ahmed has said, my question's about Centrelink benefits. The government's been paying more and more benefits to other people, but there's been nothing for the DSP during COVID. What do you think about the people on the DSP?
Bill, you're the man with the portfolio here. I reckon you should take Said's question there.
Okay. Well, I do have a view that people on the DSP are forgotten Australians. They're just forgotten. A lot of people 80% of people on the disability support pension are on it for at least 5 years. 50% of all people on the DSP are on it for at least 10 years. The most common way of getting off the disability support pension is the move into the age pension or death. A lot of people have been injured at work, or as we improve our understanding of mental health illness, have conditions which relate to their mental illness. And basically, we give up on people once they're on the DSP, and I think that's wrong. I think we need to recognise that 99.9% of people do not want to be on the DSP. They'd rather they didn't have their impairment. So I think we've got to move from viewing them as people who we're doing a favour for to people who never sought to be in this position. And so I think we need to be giving more flexibility to people on the DSP, not less. Quite frankly, we need to lift their ability to earn money. We need to recognise that disability is permanent, and the pension is more for their disability. It's not for everything else. And so I just think we need to basically, I almost have a view that the one area where a universal basic income approach could work is for people on the disability. If you've got a permanent disability, you should have that income and be allowed to do whatever you want. That's where I think it's an interesting area. That's just my own view. It's not party policy, but I think we need to reconfigure our view of people on the disability pension, that this is not in lieu of their disability. The disability is a fact of life, and really the income should be about helping them get to the starting line. When you get the disability pension, you're not getting an advantage over the rest of us. All it's meant to be trying to do is bring you up to where other people are in their income earning capacity. So they have been forgotten in COVID, no question, no question. So that's work for you and me to think about, Andrew. You can see I'm proposing. I know it hasn't been to ERC. Okay, I'm in the naughty corner. Andrew's giving me that look.
No, I think it's a great idea, Bill. But you talked about it in the context of universal basic income. I think what makes your idea so powerful is the very fact that it isn't universal, that you're talking about a group of people who are especially deserving.
Targeted, yeah. Hey, okay, now listen, there's more questions coming in, and I'm reading off two screens, and fortunately for everyone, I'm not an air traffic controller because I'm getting overwhelmed by two screens. Okay, so listen, I've seen an interesting question from Karen. I think you want to ask this to question, is that right? My staff sending me the message, is that right?
That's right, I'm happy to ask it. Karen Dimick here. Thanks, Andrew. I found your comment about increasing inequality and increasing loneliness and the connection between the two really interesting. I'm interested in what is the role of government in fostering the local community connections that are there and those incredible networks of support. We really saw that here in Maribyrnong when the high-rise towers went into hard lockdown. The community rallied and connections and incredible support was provided within hours of that occurring. And I certainly see it every day in how carers and families of children also are an invaluable source of support to each other. But I'm interested in government's role in how that can be fostered.
That's great.
Absolutely.
Question, Karen.
Thanks, Karen. Look, it's a passion project of mine. Nick Terrell and I just wrote a book called Reconnected, a community builder's handbook, in which we talk about a whole range of terrific organisations across Australia that are working to deal with the disconnection crisis. Organisations like Befriend in Perth, which creates meetups for people who might have moved to town and have no friends. Organisations such as Puddle Jumpers in South Australia, which works with disadvantaged kids to line up mentors and has one of the best volunteer recruitment strategies that I've ever seen. We talk about ways of using the internet in order to connect, what we call cyber connecting, and particularly highlight there the work of Catherine Barrett's Kindness Pandemic, which was a Facebook page that at a time when the TV screens were filled with pictures of people fighting over the last toilet paper roll, celebrated the generosity of Australians in reaching out to others and mobilised new volunteers, such as people helping with antenatal classes. But alongside needs to be a strong role for government. And I think you're absolutely right to say there, Karen, what's government doing here? There's obviously the volunteer grants supporting organisations. I'd like to see them supporting more startups, because Nick Terrell and I were really impressed at the number of fresh new startups involved in communities. Melbourne's got a great community garden project, and a lot of those community gardens around housing projects are really innovative ways of engaging people, often people who don't speak great English, but might be terrific gardeners. But there's also an importance of having a good social safety net. It's really hard to go out there and be civically active and make friends and get to know your neighbours if you're worried about where the next meal's coming from. So raising JobSeeker is a pro-community measure because it allows people that dignity to engage with the community. When we have good quality work, then we enable people to engage with their co-workers. Fragile, disconnected temp work, casual work, labour hire firms, all of them create an environment in which it's really hard to make friends at work and to build those connections. So a more stable workplace, and yes, a workplace with a higher unionisation rate would also be a place where I think we'd be more of a nation of we and less of a nation of me.
Thanks, Andrew. Listen, I've got about another 5 questions and they're very eclectic. Just William Johns has asked the question from Facebook. Australia, where do you think Australia's current position is on technology leadership and innovation? And what do you think? I've just gone off that screen. So he's asked that part of it. And how can we truly be true leaders in this advanced area? And do you feel this is one way to create real wealth for the community? Tech, innovation, leadership, what we need to do, what we're not doing.
Absolutely, William. There's a ton more we need to do. If you look across advanced countries, government in Australia spends about as much on R&D as the typical advanced country. Business doesn't. Business spending on R&D is lousy in Australia. And that's not just our industrial composition. Even our manufacturing firms aren't doing the same levels of innovation as other manufacturing firms. Only 12% of companies say they're working on an innovation that is new to the world. So we've got to do more to connect our universities up with our firms. I'm struck when you walk around the campuses of Stanford or an MIT in the States, you trip over a whole bunch of new startup firms. When you walk around Melbourne University or ANU, you come across nice cafes and bars, but not a whole lot of spin-off startups, and I'd like to see more of that. I also think we're leaving a lot of talent fallow, so I worry that to too great an extent, entrepreneurship and innovation is a bit of an elite sport in Australia. If mum and dad have got the capital to back you, if you know innovators and people who started business, then you do it. But we don't have enough programs in disadvantaged schools to pick up those lost Marie Curies, those lost Albert Einsteins, the brilliant kids who could go on to start the next Facebook or the next Apple or the next Tesla, but just don't get the mentors and the capital support. UTS is probably doing this best. They aim to not just have a small entrepreneurship group, but to have half of their students having an entrepreneurial experience. And that's, again, a way of mainstreaming innovation and entrepreneurship, which is really, I think, going to both make us a more innovative country, therefore more productive and faster growing, and also a more egalitarian country. So this idea that you've got to choose between fairness and growth, that's a false trade-off. We can have both.
Thanks, Andrew. Listen, Zelinda McNeil's put a question on which is sort of goes to our core business, I think, as Labor people. She said, how are the needs of citizens going to be met with prices on things like rent and power increasing? Cost of living, it's just grinding. That last bit forward's mine.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, Bill, you've thought about this harder than me. Let me do a quick answer, and then you can give the real truth on it. Wages have been falling behind productivity in Australia. Productivity growth has been pretty lousy, but wage growth's been even worse. And this week we saw the worst ever wages growth on record, 0.1%. So in real terms, wages are going backwards. It's not a COVID effect in particular. It's a long-running trend. As Matthias Cormann said, it's a deliberate design feature of the coalition government's policies. Their idea is that they want workers to be paid less, and under them, we've seen more income going to capital and less going to labour. You just can't sustain the system that way. You've got to have capitalism that works for everyone, and that means wages that are growing strongly. It is in the interest of business to have this done. I always find myself saying to business leaders who complain about having to pay penalty rates, well, first of all, it's the basic decency that if someone's working on a Sunday getting you a coffee, you might want to compensate them for not being with their family. But secondly, those people on penalty rates, they're ploughing that money straight back into the economy. Give a pay rise to a CEO earning multi-million dollars, they're going to bank a lot of it. Raise the penalty rates for a barista, they're going to spend it all straight away. That's good for growth.
Yeah, listen, stronger wage rises, more social housing to take the pressure off rental prices, more renewable energy. These are all ways of lowering the cost of living. Better income and better support to take away some of the drivers of increasing price demand in power and housing. Listen, John Barker's asked an interesting question. Why is company tax the same for the financial services industry? Why is it the same for that as it is for manufacturing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the principle that we've taken, John, is trying to maintain some equality across the system where we have profits tax regardless of what you do. And there are countries that have tried to tailor the tax system according to your particular industry. but you end up getting a whole bunch of fiddling. You get people who are working in one sector trying to dress themselves up to as though they're in another sector, and you get some weird distortions in terms of how firms operate. I certainly don't think that we need to engage in a race to the bottom in company tax. The fact is that cutting company taxes largely benefits shareholders rather than workers. And Joe Biden is going to be pushing over the course of the next term to bring the US company tax rate back up. So the strongest argument of the Conservatives, I think, has been, well, Australia needs to follow the US. But if Biden wins control of Congress in the midterms in 2022, the US corporate tax rate is likely to go back to somewhere closer to where it was.
Yeah, and I'd add, John, when you reduce company tax rates beyond a certain point, you're rewarding companies for previous investments. What we want to do is incentivise companies for new investments. So I think more targeted interventions in the economy, which will incentivise investing in new productivity and manufacturing or anywhere else. Listen, there's a couple of questions. They're a bit of they're both coming on the same topic from slightly different angles. Rachel Higgins-Treacock has raised the point: how do we foster community? And then there's a very specific point by Amanda Tesler-Sharing saying, how do we prevent every community organisation being dismissed as politically motivated?
Well, putting on my Shadow Assistant Minister for Charities hat, Rachel and Amanda, I think these couldn't be finer questions. The Coalition has been waging a war on charities over the recent years, attacking environmental charities for advocating on climate change, attacking legal charities for advocating on law reform, attacking anti-poverty charities for campaigning on inequality. And the fact is that our public debate is stronger when we have the voices of charities informed by the work that they do with the vulnerable, with the environment, with people who are in the courts. So we need those charitable voices in there making the case for reform. But the case for building civic community, I think, is extremely strong, and that's work that all of us need to take on. In the area of politics, the book that I was most influenced by this year was a book called Politics is for Power by an American political scientist called Etan Hirsch. And Etan says the problem with politics over the recent decades is people have started treating it like being a sports fan. You know, you turn up to a sports game and you might be cheering for Richmond against Collingwood. You cheer Richmond, you boo Collingwood. And at the end of the day, you don't think for a moment that a Collingwood fan is going to come over and say, hey, good point, I'm going to be a Richmond fan next week. If we treat politics the same way, the system starts to fall apart. If we just think that politics is cheering and jeering, if it's trading insults on social media, that's enormously corrosive to the system and particularly damaging to social democrats, because we're the guys who think that government has a role in helping the vulnerable. So we've got to get away from this hobbyist idea of politics and into a much more engaged politics. I've done my first deliberative democracy forum, found it fantastic, a really useful way of engaging. But I think also encouraging people
Do you want to unpack, Andrew, do you want to unpack what you meant by deliberative democracy forum?
Yeah, sure. So it was.
I'm not sure everyone.
Absolutely. So the idea of a deliberative democracy forum is you get people into the room to talk about a complicated issue and to share their perspectives. In this case, we focused on the upcoming conscience vote on mitochondrial donation, but deliberative democracy forums have been done in everything from the Republic to how to spend the local council budget. And it's a great way of ensuring that politics is a sport in which everyone is on the field and no one's in the stands. I've also argued in Reconnected that there's a huge role to be played in terms of building social capital in disadvantaged communities. Willie Sutton, the American bank robber, was once asked why he robbed banks, and he said, oh, I rob banks because that's where the money is. So Nick and I came up with this idea of Sutton's law of social capital, which is that if you want to build community, you've got to start with the most vulnerable. Some of the after-school community sporting programs being done with refugees, engaging with sports such as soccer, do this really effectively. The community gardens and public housing communities that I mentioned before are a fabulous example. So looking to the most vulnerable communities to build the strength of community, that Sutton's Law of Social Capital, along with cyber connecting, is a couple of the ways in which we think you can turn Australia into a more connected society and a less lonely place.
Hey, that's great, Andrew. And listen, I've got a great question from Janine Kavanagh, which I'm going to read out. But just to remind, Amanda Tesla sharing did say, how do we prevent organisations being dismissed as politically motivated? Under a Labor government, you're allowed to be an advocate. It's okay. Like, I get that disability organisations shouldn't be funded just to deliver services. They have a right, if they notice a pattern of what's happening to people, to advocate for it. So this is a government who's got its hands over its eyes, it's got its hands over its ears, and it's got its hand over its, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And that's, community organisations have an obligation, in my opinion, to be the auditors of our civil society and to let us know what is happening. Anyway, so Amanda, there's just a different philosophy between Liberal and Labor there. Janine has asked me to read this question out. She said, unfortunately, Medicare and the public health system don't cover those like me who have little own illnesses to see private specialists privately, and JobSeeker's too low a support income for people who need to see specialists. I wish we could pay more attention in regard to suicide and mental health to the past decade and research on microglia. The research is in its infancy and it could provide insights. So what do you think, Andrew, in terms of how we could better do this system? I mean, that's it's a whole forum in itself. So to be unfair,
I'm keen to hear your views in particular, but I do think that making sure that the medical research is going to the right place involves listening to the experts a little more. There's one thing that COVID's taught us. It's that experts have a lot to say in the area of medical research, but the Medical Research Future Fund is too political, too driven by the people that get in the minister's ear rather than the real needs. And so I think moving some of that back to funding the research programs that have the biggest benefit for the community is vital. And Janine talks about one of the many reasons that we need to raise JobSeeker, which is that many of those on JobSeeker have medical issues, significantly more than in the broader community, and providing them with the opportunities to travel to medical specialist appointments with a bit of extra money to have there for an emergency. All of that is vital. Being poor isn't just about having low income; it's also about having volatile income and being so susceptible to risks and shocks. That's one of the things we tried to address with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, but there's still a lot of bad shocks that can hit people for which government doesn't help them. But Bill, what's you thought very hard about this over recent years?
Well, I mean, along with research, subacute care. When there's a trauma or an emergency, there's a system in place. But once someone comes out of the emergency or the trauma, families are really the individuals and their families are really cast on their own devices. So I think subacute care is a sweet spot. COVID's taught us a lot about a lot of things, and I'm going to come to questions on income support in a moment, Andrew. The COVID, I think, has exposed pre-existing fault lines in our society. You made the point about wages. You could make the same point about aged care. You could make the same point, I think, about in Melbourne, you can get more than 10 Medicare funded visits for mental health support. It's homelessness in the CBD has not been completely eliminated, but it's been largely reduced. And JobSeeker, the unthinkable happened, and it significantly increased. So bizarrely, this government, not for the reasons that it should have, but for the reasons of crisis, has taken some steps to alleviate poverty. And the question for us is, be it aged care, be it mental health support, be it income support, how do we retain that? Because it actually leads to a better economic and equity outcome. So there'd been questions both on the public service, which I'll come to specifically in a moment, but Labor, what about us backing in permanent increase. This is from Chrissy Flynn, a permanent increase in unemployment welfare.
Yeah, we certainly do, Bill, and we're
Andrew.
hoping that it happens sooner rather than later.
It should happen. It's as simple as that. Now, Andrew's speeding up answers because we've just got so many questions. The hour's nearly finished, so we're heading to our final questions here. A couple of ones on employment and probably three on the public service. One from Dave Emmerton, will we restore the CES? Job provider companies are doing so much damage. Two, from Mark Jefferson, what are the best incentives we can give people to employ older workers, and what would we do for older unemployment? And three, how do we deal with from Eric McNeil, how do we deal with public service being watered down to a point where we're no longer getting frank and fearless advice and it's being replaced with pee in your pocket outsourced providers from the private sector? I just read that out because I thought it summed it
absolutely. Dave, in terms of the CES, I think there is a lot to be said for having a public provider in that system. You know, we saw when Medibank Private was in government hands that it acted as a check on the private health insurance firms. And once that was sold off, you saw many more problems in the private health insurance industry. You've got the United States now saying, well, they won't go fully public, but they might create a public option because they realise the value that would bring to their healthcare system. And in the same way, I think having a public option in the employment finding space would be really valuable. The question of frank and fearless advice is one that really dispirits me as a Canberran who's spent time seconded into Treasury and seen the erosion under the coalition of the idea that public servants might tell you something you don't want to hear. The fact is that most public servants aren't out there to serve a particular political agenda. They just want to do what's best for the country. But the cutbacks to the public service, the arbitrary staffing cap, which ends up costing the taxpayer more and has rolling cohorts of consultants, and just the approach to... sorry about that. Dropped you guys down for a moment there.
Andrew feels very strongly on this.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, getting fired up about the public service. The way in which former Liberal staffers have been put in to head public service agencies, rather than having people who understand the institutions, have the deep connections, and are able to say, look, Minister, we tried this 15 years ago, it didn't work, and here's why. Now, Bill, that's 2 out of 3 questions. You'll have to remind me of the middle one.
Older workers.
Yes, the mature age worker bonuses are not bad. They have very low take-up rates, and the young worker bonuses, I think, could well lead to crowd out. And there's not a provision in the legislation that provides security to older workers that they won't be replaced by a younger worker. Worse still, there's an incentive to invest in more machines. And if you're an older worker, your boss is getting an incentive to hire a younger worker, an incentive to invest in a machine because they can write it off in the first year, but no incentive to hire you. So the budget really was not framed with a thought to how it will affect over 35s, particularly over 35s in industries that are vulnerable to mechanisation. Sure, we want technological change, but we've got to bring people along with it.
Hey, that was great. And by the way, we would welcome people's suggestion on policy ideas. I mean, we've had about 20 so far here. Very quickly, there's other questions, but Ross Bevans asked about get rid of the labour hire mobs. If Labor was in, we'd have more permanent public servants, not more labour hire casuals. I mean, it's a fiction what the government do. They put people as labour hire and with less rights, but what we see is a diminution of the public service at the same time. A whole lot of people with insecure work when we actually need these people. So it's just ideology trumping common sense. There were a couple of questions though, briefly on tax. A turnover tax makes more sense, according to Janine Roberts. And Jonathan Mann said, we have progressive company tax schedule.
Yeah, so Janine, the challenge with the turnover tax is best thought of by imagining a consulting firm next to a petrol station. The petrol station makes a profit of maybe a couple of cents a litre on its turnover. The consulting firm, essentially all of its revenue is profit. So under a turnover tax, you'd essentially be saying that the tax being paid by the petrol station was, I don't know, 100 times higher than the tax being paid by the consulting firm. So that's why traditionally we've taxed people on profit rather than on turnover. Bill, I thought your point on temporary hire before was really astute. These firms started in the 1950s to fill vacancies when people were sick. They've got a perfectly valid role there. They have no valid role stepping in to supplant workforces because employers want more pliable workers. And I've even heard that this might be an issue on the Snowy 2.0 scheme with contractors using labour hire firms in order to not have a well-paid unionised workforce which stands up for a safe workplace.
Hey, Andrew, we're reaching the death knock, and because we always like to finish on time, that way we guarantee to get people back for further forums. Listen, one of the last questions amongst some of the good ones still to go is that Kay was saying the attack on universities. I mean, she says a bit more, but, you know, give us your take on the government's dismantling distortion of our universities and the courses students can choose. What do you think? And then we'll wrap up.
Well, to ask a former professor how he feels about the attack on universities is a very generous way for you to end the forum. So thanks for that, Karen. I'm appalled that the government hasn't seen that the response to a human capital crisis is to invest in human capital. We ought to be opening up the universities to every kid that's got the smarts to go there. The youth labour market is appalling right now. And we should do the analogue of what the Keating government did in the early 1990s when they said to young people, stay on at school, finish school. And the year 12 completion rate went through the roof, I think from about 5 in 10 to about 8 in 10, just over a couple of years there. The equivalent of finishing year 12 back in the early 90s today is to go and get a uni degree. Makes you more productive, less likely to need taxpayer support in the future, more likely to be able to innovate, as we were talking about before. So why wouldn't you be throwing resources into universities to train the next generation at a time when the youth labour market is lousy? But, you know, one thing you can say about the mob running the country at the moment, they're never too busy to have a culture war. And they've decided that their culture war on universities and on the humanities in particular trumps good economic policy. Bill, thank you very much for the conversation. You have such a brilliant group of people that you get involved in these Maribyrnong forums. Been a real privilege chatting with you tonight.
Hey, no, and I just want to thank you. Listen, Chris Mosley's raised a great question, which we'll take offline, but he says that the job and unemployment statistics are totally gamed. We don't have a stable participation index. So, so it's the old ABS stats. What's real? What isn't? What are we measuring? What are we missing? So we'll take that offline, Chris, but great point. And Nathan Bennett, of course, drew attention to the AFP rating at Trade Union Office again. I mean, if only all the criminals in Australia were hanging out in unions, then the AFP could get them all in one raid. But anyway, we don't know the circumstances, but Nathan, Labor will always stand up for working people, the right of people to find work, the right of people to have good work, and the right of people to go to work safely, and the right of people to retire and have, after they've worked their lives, to have dignified retirement. So that's our game, and we will be very staunch on that. Andrew, you are a standout speaker and you have lots of ideas, and you are, you know, you speak to the better angels of Labor's policy nature, and you have an open mind and you are prepared to advance the argument. So thank you very much. I know my branch members and people who subscribe to our lists will have found your answers forthright, stimulating, and food for thought.
Pleasure and a privilege, Bill.
Good night, everyone. And now we've got Claire O'Neill coming up in December, I promised, and you can have a rest from ideas over Christmas, and stay safe in COVID, and a special shout out to the South Australians. We Melburnians do know what you're going through. Good luck.